There are certain changes in our bodies that most of us would rather not think about. We lose a little energy. We eat less than we used to. We sleep longer. Maybe we don't enjoy conversations or activities quite the way we once did. And because we're getting older, we tell ourselves the same thing. It's just age. But what if it isn't? What if several small changes, appearing together and becoming progressively more noticeable, are trying to tell us something important about our health? That's what we're going to talk about today. 7 changes that can sometimes appear when a person's body is becoming severely frail, seriously ill, or in certain circumstances approaching the final stage of life. Now, please listen carefully to this next part, because it's important. No single sign in this video means that you or someone you love is dying. Not one. Loss of appetite, fatigue, weakness, weight loss, social withdrawal, confusion, and changes in breathing can have many causes. Some of those causes may be treatable. An infection can cause weakness and confusion. Medication can affect appetite and energy. Depression can cause withdrawal. Dehydration can make a person tired and disoriented. Heart, lung, kidney, liver, neurological, and other medical conditions can cause many of the changes we're about to discuss. So please don't use this video to diagnose yourself or someone you love. What matters is the pattern. How many changes are occurring together? How quickly are they progressing? Does the person have an advanced illness? Are ordinary daily activities becoming increasingly difficult? And most importantly, what does a qualified healthcare professional find after a proper evaluation? But there's another reason we need to have this conversation. Too many of us dismiss meaningful changes with 4 simple words. I'm just getting old. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it isn't. And there's a big difference between living with fear and paying attention. Fear assumes the worst. Paying attention asks questions. And sometimes asking the right question at the right time can make an enormous difference. I want to tell you about a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor is a fictionalized example, created to represent experiences that many older adults and families may recognize. She was 81 years old and lived outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the same modest 2-story house where she and her late husband Robert had raised their children. Eleanor was independent, stubborn too. If her daughter Susan offered to bring groceries, Eleanor would say, "I still know where the supermarket is." When her son Mark suggested installing another handrail, she replied, "I'm old, not incompetent." And whenever anyone asked how she was feeling, Eleanor gave the same answer. "I'm fine." The answer was so familiar that everyone stopped questioning it. Until one winter, Susan began noticing little things. Her mother's coffee would go cold before she finished it. Groceries expired untouched in the refrigerator. Phone conversations became shorter. Eleanor stopped going upstairs and quietly began sleeping in the downstairs guest room. Then one afternoon, Susan found something beside her mother's favorite chair. A sealed envelope. On the front, in Eleanor's careful handwriting, were 2 words. For Susan. When Mark saw the letter, his expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. And what Susan eventually discovered was that the unopened letter was connected to something Eleanor had been unable to say aloud. We'll come back to that letter. But first, we need to understand the earliest change Eleanor's family had dismissed for months. And it's our first sign. A persistent loss of appetite or reduced interest in food and fluids. For Eleanor, it began with breakfast. For most of her life, breakfast had been a ritual. Coffee, toast, sometimes scrambled eggs on Sundays. Then one morning, Susan noticed that her mother took 2 bites of toast and pushed the plate away. "Not hungry," Eleanor said. "Nothing frightening about that. We all have days when we don't feel like eating." But the next week, it happened again, and then again. The portions became smaller. Meals were skipped. Food Susan delivered remained untouched. What seemed like one harmless morning had quietly become a pattern. Loss of appetite can happen for many reasons as we age. Changes in taste and smell, dental problems, medication side effects, depression, constipation, pain, infection, and other medical conditions can all reduce someone's desire to eat. But in people with advanced serious illness or severe frailty, appetite may also decrease as the body's energy requirements and ability to process food change. The important word here is persistent. One unfinished meal tells us very little. But when someone who normally eats regularly begins consistently refusing food, losing weight, becoming weaker, or drinking much less than usual, that's a change worth noticing. And please remember, forcing someone to eat without understanding what's happening isn't always the right answer either, particularly in advanced illness or near the end of life. This is where individualized medical guidance becomes important. The question isn't simply, how do we make this person eat more? The better question is, why has their appetite changed? That's what Susan finally started asking. She opened Eleanor's refrigerator and found expired milk, untouched leftovers, and a carton of eggs that hadn't moved in days. Then in the trash, she saw half a piece of toast wrapped in a paper towel. At that moment, she remembered something. 3 months earlier, Eleanor had stopped finishing breakfast. The first sign had been there all along, but the second change was harder to explain away. Eleanor was sleeping. A lot. And that brings us to sign number 2. Increasing sleep and profound fatigue. Now, needing more rest as we get older isn't automatically a sign of serious decline. Sleep patterns change. Poor nighttime sleep can lead to daytime fatigue. Certain medications cause drowsiness, so can depression, anemia, infection, sleep apnea, thyroid problems, and many other medical conditions. But Susan wasn't noticing an occasional afternoon nap. Her mother was sleeping through mornings. She fell asleep in her chair before finishing coffee. She stopped answering calls before noon, and sometimes after sleeping for 10 hours at night, she seemed exhausted only a few hours later. This was not Eleanor's normal pattern. That's the distinction I want you to remember. When we talk about changes in older adults, comparison with the person's own baseline is often more meaningful than comparing them with another person of the same age. Some 70-year-olds run marathons. Some need help walking across a room. Age alone doesn't tell the whole story. Change does. If you've known someone for years, you may notice the subtle differences before anyone else. They don't call as often. They no longer finish a familiar task. They need to sit down halfway through something they once completed easily. Or the person who was always awake by 7 suddenly sleeps until noon. Again, none of that proves someone is dying. But a major, persistent change deserves attention. For Eleanor, increased sleep was happening alongside appetite loss. 2 changes, not 1. Susan began writing them down. Not because she wanted to prove her mother was dying, because she wanted to stop guessing. And I think that's something many of us can learn from. When you notice meaningful health changes, write down what you're actually seeing. When did it start? How often does it happen? Is it getting worse? What medications is the person taking? Are there other new symptoms? Specific observations can be far more useful to a healthcare professional than simply saying, something seems wrong. If you've ever watched someone you love change gradually, and wondered whether it was normal aging or something more, you're certainly not alone. If you feel comfortable, tell me in the comments. What was the first small change you noticed? Your experience may help another person realize that asking questions isn't overreacting. And if you value calm, respectful conversations about senior health, aging, independence, and the difficult subjects we don't always know how to discuss, subscribe. That's exactly what we talk about here. Now, Eleanor's third change was one she tried very hard to hide. Sign number 3, progressive weakness and difficulty performing ordinary activities. For nearly 40 years, Eleanor's bedroom had been upstairs. Then Susan noticed a nightgown hanging in the downstairs guest room. A toothbrush appeared in the first-floor bathroom. Several sweaters had been moved downstairs. Eleanor said she was reorganizing. She wasn't. The truth was simpler and harder. Climbing the stairs had become exhausting, but Eleanor didn't tell anyone because she was afraid of what would happen next. Would her children tell her she couldn't live alone? Would they take away her car keys? Would they start making decisions without her? Would every conversation suddenly become about assisted living? This is something families sometimes overlook. Older adults don't always hide symptoms because they're confused or difficult. Sometimes they hide them because they are afraid of losing control. Independence isn't just the ability to cook a meal or drive to the store. For many of us, independence is identity. It's dignity. It's the right to decide how we live. And when an older adult feels that admitting weakness will immediately cause other people to take over, silence can feel safer than honesty. But progressive weakness deserves evaluation because it can have many causes. Infection, anemia, medication effects, heart disease, lung disease, malnutrition, dehydration, neurological problems, muscle loss, pain, a recent fall, prolonged inactivity. Some causes can be addressed, but in advanced illness and severe frailty, growing weakness may also reflect the body's declining reserves. The pattern may look like this. First, the person stops doing yard work. Then shopping becomes difficult. Then bathing requires more effort. Then getting dressed becomes exhausting. Eventually, even walking from one room to another may require assistance. The important thing isn't to look at one difficult day. Look at the direction of change. Is the person's world gradually becoming smaller because their body can no longer support the activities they once performed? For Eleanor, the answer was yes. But she wasn't ready to admit it. And Mark wasn't ready to hear it. Whenever Susan expressed concern, he said the same thing. "She's 81. What do you expect?" That sentence became the family's greatest comfort, and eventually its greatest source of regret, because something else was happening. Eleanor's clothes no longer fit. Sign number 4. Unintentional weight loss and visible physical decline. Susan noticed it when Eleanor put on her winter coat. The coat had always fit snugly around her shoulders. Now it hung loosely. "Have you lost weight?" Susan asked. Eleanor shrugged. Maybe the coat stretched. It was exactly the kind of answer that could make someone smile, and Eleanor knew it. Humor had always been one of her defenses. But coats don't usually stretch that way. Unintentional weight loss in an older adult deserves attention. There are many possible explanations. Dental problems can make eating painful. Medication can change appetite. Depression can reduce interest in food. Digestive conditions can interfere with nutrient absorption. Thyroid problems, diabetes, cancer, chronic organ disease, dementia, and many other conditions may contribute to unintended weight loss. This is why unexplained weight loss should not simply be dismissed as aging. And it's also why we should never jump directly from weight loss to the conclusion that someone is nearing death. That would be irresponsible. But in the context of advanced disease or severe frailty, progressive weight and muscle loss can sometimes reflect a deeper decline in the body's ability to maintain itself. Susan didn't know which explanation applied to Eleanor. That uncertainty frightened her. Mark responded differently. He became angry, not at Eleanor, at Susan. "You're turning everything into a symptom," he said. Susan replied, "and you're turning every symptom into nothing." That was the moment their argument stopped being about food or sleep or a loose winter coat. It became about fear. Susan feared waiting too long. Mark feared what they might discover if they looked too closely. Both loved their mother. Both believed they were protecting her. And both had forgotten something essential. Eleanor was still there. She deserved to be part of the conversation. One afternoon, Susan finally asked her directly, "Mom, are you afraid something is wrong?" Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I'm more afraid of all of you deciding what happens to me." That answer changed the conversation. Because caring for an older person should not mean erasing them from decisions about their own life. Whenever possible, we should speak with older adults, not merely about them. Ask what they're experiencing. Ask what matters most to them. Ask what they're afraid of. Ask what kind of help they would accept. Because sometimes the deepest suffering isn't caused by the symptom itself. It's caused by feeling unheard. And for Eleanor, that fear of losing control contributed to the 5th sign. She began withdrawing from people. Sign number 5. Social withdrawal and reduced engagement with the world. Eleanor had attended the same church for more than 30 years. She knew who sat in every pew. She remembered birthdays. She brought food when someone was sick. Then she stopped going. At first, it was the weather, then fatigue, then a headache. Then she simply didn't feel like it. Her phone conversations became shorter. She stopped watching her favorite mystery program. The newspaper remained folded on the kitchen table. Now, social withdrawal can have many explanations. Depression is one important possibility, and depression in older adults should never be dismissed as a normal part of aging. Pain can make socializing difficult. Hearing loss can make conversations exhausting. Grief can cause people to retreat. So can anxiety, medication effects, cognitive changes, infection, fatigue, and many physical illnesses. And sometimes a person simply wants more quiet. We have to be careful not to treat introversion or a desire for privacy as disease. But when a socially engaged person becomes persistently withdrawn at the same time that appetite, energy, strength, and weight are declining, the complete pattern deserves attention. Susan began to realize that Eleanor wasn't merely doing less. Her world was becoming smaller. The upstairs bedroom, then church, then long conversations, then meals. Little by little, ordinary parts of her life were disappearing. And then came a change that frightened Susan more than all the others. Her mother forgot something she had never forgotten before. Sign number 6. Confusion, altered awareness, or changes in communication. It happened on a Sunday morning. Susan called Eleanor and mentioned that it was Robert's birthday. There was silence. Then Eleanor asked, "Robert who?" Susan froze. Robert was Eleanor's late husband. They had been married for 47 years. A few seconds later, Eleanor corrected herself. "Of course I know who you mean. I'm tired." And maybe she was, but Susan wrote it down. Sudden confusion in an older adult should be taken seriously, and this is one of the most important distinctions in the entire video. Confusion can result from potentially treatable or urgent medical problems. Infection, dehydration, medication reactions, low oxygen, blood sugar abnormalities, electrolyte disturbances, stroke, head injury, and other medical conditions. A sudden change in mental status can require prompt medical evaluation. Do not simply assume it's dementia, and do not assume it's normal aging. In people with advanced illness who are actively declining, changes in awareness, communication, wakefulness, and orientation may also occur. But context matters enormously. How suddenly did it begin? Is there fever? Was there a fall? Is the person having difficulty speaking? Is there new weakness on one side of the body? Are they struggling to breathe? If confusion is sudden, severe, or accompanied by other alarming symptoms, seek urgent medical help. Susan didn't know what was causing Eleanor's moment of confusion, but she now had 6 observations written in her notebook. Reduced appetite, increasing sleep, progressive weakness, weight loss, social withdrawal, and a change in awareness. It was time to stop debating and seek professional guidance. But before that conversation could happen, Mark finally admitted something he had been hiding. Eleanor had called him 2 weeks earlier. She had asked him one question. "Was your father afraid at the end?" Mark had told her no. But it wasn't true. Robert had been afraid. He had been afraid of pain. Afraid of leaving Eleanor alone. Afraid his children would remember only the weakest version of him. Mark had carried that conversation for 6 years, and when his mother asked about it, he changed the subject. Not because he didn't care, because he cared so much that he couldn't face what the question might mean. That night, Susan placed the sealed letter on the kitchen table. She still didn't open it. Eleanor had written it. Eleanor was still capable of speaking for herself. So Susan asked her, "Mom, why did you write me this letter?" Eleanor looked at the envelope. "Because some things are easier to write than to say." "Do you think you're dying?" Eleanor was quiet. Then she answered, "I think I'm changing, and I think all of you are so busy being afraid of what that means that nobody has asked me what I want. Sometimes the most important question isn't how much time is left. Sometimes it's what matters most now." And that brings us to sign number 7. Significant changes in breathing during active physical decline. I want to be especially careful with this one. Ordinary shortness of breath is not proof that someone is dying. Breathing difficulty can be caused by asthma, pneumonia, heart failure, chronic lung disease, anemia, anxiety, blood clots, infection, and other conditions, some of which can be emergencies. New, severe, or rapidly worsening breathing difficulty requires prompt medical attention. But in a person who is already known to be actively dying from advanced illness, breathing patterns may change. Breaths may become more shallow. The rhythm may become irregular. There may be pauses between breaths. Congestion or secretions may cause noisy breathing. These changes can be distressing for families to witness, and healthcare professionals, including hospice and palliative care teams when appropriate, can help explain what is happening and provide comfort-focused care. But remember this carefully. You cannot determine that someone is in the final stage of life from breathing changes alone. Context matters. Diagnosis matters. The person's overall condition matters. Professional evaluation matters. Eleanor's breathing had not reached that stage, and that's important to our story, because the purpose of recognizing these 7 changes was never to declare that Eleanor was dying. It was to recognize that something meaningful was happening and that her family needed to stop guessing. When Eleanor was properly evaluated, the answer was not simple. Some of her problems had potentially treatable contributors. Her medications needed review, her hydration and nutrition needed attention, her increasing frailty required support, and her family needed honest conversations about her wishes and how she wanted to live. There was no dramatic prediction. No exact number of months, no countdown. Real life is rarely that neat. But there was clarity, and sometimes clarity is the beginning of relief. A few days later, Eleanor handed Susan the envelope herself. Now you can read it. Inside were 3 pages. Not a goodbye letter, not exactly. Eleanor had written about Robert, about the house, about her fear of becoming a burden, about her greater fear that her children would begin making decisions without asking her. And near the end, she had written something Susan would remember for the rest of her life. Please don't confuse helping me with taking my life away from me. If I need help, I will try to accept it, but let me remain part of the decisions for as long as I can. Susan cried. Mark did too, although he turned toward the window and pretended he hadn't. The letter did not solve everything. Eleanor was still frail. She still needed more support than before. There were still medical appointments, difficult decisions, good days, and frightening ones. But something changed. The family stopped assuming. They started asking. They stopped speaking around Eleanor. They spoke with her. Mark apologized for dismissing the changes. Susan admitted that her fear had sometimes made her treat every symptom like a catastrophe, and Eleanor agreed to accept help without surrendering her voice. That is the lesson I hope you remember from these 7 signs. Paying attention does not mean assuming the worst. It does not mean that every missed meal is a warning of death. It does not mean that every nap, every moment of weakness, or every forgotten word means the final stage of life has begun. It means noticing meaningful change. Looking for patterns, ruling out treatable problems, seeking appropriate medical care, and refusing to dismiss everything with the words, "I'm just getting old." So let's quickly remember the 7 changes we discussed. A persistent loss of appetite or reduced interest in food and fluids, increasing sleep and profound fatigue, progressive weakness and difficulty with ordinary activities, unintentional weight loss and visible physical decline, social withdrawal or reduced engagement, confusion, altered awareness, or changes in communication, and, in the appropriate clinical context, significant changes in breathing during active decline. No one sign tells the whole story. The pattern matters, the progression matters, the person's underlying health matters, and professional medical evaluation matters. If you're experiencing new or worsening symptoms, don't diagnose yourself from a video. Ask questions. Write down the changes you've noticed. Talk to your healthcare professional. And if a symptom is sudden, severe, or potentially life-threatening, such as serious breathing difficulty, signs of stroke, severe confusion, or another medical emergency, seek urgent help. Growing older requires courage, not because we should live in fear of what our bodies might do next, but because there are truths about aging that deserve honest conversations. Our bodies change, our needs change, sometimes our strength changes. But dignity should not disappear with age. Your voice still matters, your wishes still matter, your questions still matter. And needing help does not mean becoming invisible. If there is one thing I hope you take away from Eleanor's story, it is this. Don't assume the worst, but don't ignore meaningful change either. Pay attention without panic. Ask questions without shame. And when someone you love is growing older, listen carefully. Sometimes what they need most isn't another person telling them what to do. Sometimes they need someone willing to ask, "What do you want?" and then truly listen to the answer. If this conversation helped you, subscribe for more calm, respectful discussions about aging, senior health, independence, and the subjects many people avoid until they become impossible to ignore. And I'd like to leave you with one final question. Which of these 7 changes do you think families are most likely to dismiss as simply normal aging? Share your thoughts in the comments if you feel comfortable, because sometimes one honest experience can help another person ask an important question sooner. Take good care of yourself. Pay attention to your body.